We share these streets. True tales of everyday folk in bygone Nottingham. Episode 1. Frank. There's an old shop sign that's always intrigued me in Nottingham city centre. It's on Goosegate in Hockley and it reads The Wireless Stores. It's unusual to have any old shop sign on display in Nottingham, and this one is hidden in plain sight. The building, as far as I remember, has housed various eateries and takeaways over the years, but in my lifetime at least hasn't been a wireless store. The text of the sign is vaguely retro and painted on glass. The panes of glass around the text feature an Art Deco design. It makes me think instinctively of the 1930s and 40s, the era my grandparents were young adults in the city centre. The word wireless in itself is evocative for armchair historians. It calls to mind a time when capturing radio waves in your home was the cutting edge of entertainment technology. Weather reports and forecasts from the seas surrounding Britain could be heard by a youth in Sherwood as he scanned a map of the coast and dreamt of one day travelling afar in a ship or a boat. Seemingly authentic news reports of a Martian invasion of Earth were gravely intoned and could strike fear into the heart of Strelly. With a twist of a dial, a couple in St Anne's could invite the music of an Austrian orchestra into their terraced home and perfect their waltz in the living room. It'll have to be a 1/8 turn to avoid the half, Vera. You be careful, duck. The wireless stores on Goosegate sold and repaired radio sets and later televisions. It was also somewhere enthusiasts could buy parts to make their own radio sets, which was a popular hobby in the 1930s and 40s. Looking through old newspaper reports, we found details of a theft from the wireless stores in 1933 and a subsequent prosecution. Trying to get a detailed picture of the theft is difficult from the contemporaneous news reports, which typically were written in brief to reserve column inches for the bigger stories. This is what we were able to glean. A man named Frank had visited the wireless stores. He was a radio-making enthusiast and in the past had constructed sets that he sold to other people. On one particular visit on a Thursday, he noticed in a display in the doorway were 2 valves which were needed to make the radio sets. As he left, he took them without paying, and here's where there's a blind spot in the reports. It seems likely that the wireless store's owner must have become aware that the valves were missing a little later, but had enough of a notion that it was Frank that had taken them. Frank sold the stolen valves to someone unnamed, then visited the wireless stores the following Saturday. The shop owner actually detained him and called the police. Frank was arrested and in the subsequent court hearing was put on probation for 2 years under probation officer Mr. F.E. Polton. The newspaper reports about the incident, although brief, give quite a lot of detail about Frank. In 1933 he lived at 40 Upper Eldon Street, an address which still exists in Sneinton. He was a miner, not in the sense of being a juvenile, but in the sense that he worked in a mine. His father had left his mother and they had been, quote, particularly destitute at one time. Mr. Polton presented an interesting defence that Frank had, quote, made the mistake of getting married too soon. It doesn't mention it in the story, but Frank married Margaret in 1931 when he was 19 and she 27. I'm not sure if the probation officer is perhaps alluding to this age difference. The articles go on to say that Frank was a wireless enthusiast and had constructed and sold 15 radio sets. I imagine this is how the wireless store's owner had managed to detain him. Frank was probably a regular in the shop, and so the owner could have been fairly confident at seeing him again and perhaps setting his trap. I wonder if the owner liked Frank and wrestled with his conscience about reporting him, knowing that he'd had a difficult upbringing. Potentially he had no such qualms and was a strict authoritarian. Whatever the truth, there's a lot more to the story than the newspaper ink tells us. One particular line in the Nottingham Evening Post article caught my eye. It said Frank had been in trouble before in 1930 for stealing potatoes. We found details of this incident too. It took place in October 1930, so 3 years before the wireless store's theft, when Frank was only 19. The newspaper story describing this one has a brilliant headline, "Rounded Up by Motorcycle." Frank at this time is described as living at 1 Lily Terrace on Castle Street, which is another Sneinton address still in existence. In this incident, Frank and 3 local mates seem to have ridden bicycles out to a field in Tollerton one Sunday morning with the intention of stealing potatoes. They'd helped themselves to a quantity and were leaving the site when the field owner, William Brooker, gave chase on a motorcycle. Brooker described to the court how he rounded up the youths, and I have to say it's quite an exciting image for the local paper. I like to imagine that Brooker was a fan of cowboy movies and had seen his chance at capturing these outlaws and earning a moment in the spotlight. He was the brave sheriff, outnumbered but confident on his trusty steed. After being rounded up, Frank and his friends were arrested and later went to court. They were fined 5 shillings each, which is about £11 in today's money, but back then had more purchasing power. They were also warned about avoiding similar offences in the future. So in his younger days, Frank got into trouble for stealing potatoes and then later stealing valves from the wireless stores. They say these things come in threes, and so it is with newspaper articles about Frank. On the 15th of June 1945, the Nottingham Evening Post carried a story with the headline, "Acquired coal unlawfully. 2 men fined at Nottingham." One of the 2 men was our Frank, who at the time of the article was living in St Stephen's Avenue, a stone's throw from the previous addresses we've seen for him. Frank's in his mid-30s at this point, and in the article it says that a man named Price had delivered the stolen coal to him and another man living at the Rutland Arms on Newark Street in Sneinton. Price had already been convicted of stealing the coal, and the article makes a point of saying that Frank and the other man didn't necessarily know it was stolen. The Evening Post contains an interesting detail, that Frank at this time ran a wireless repair shop. The stolen coal seller Price had visited Frank, quote, in his shop to get a wireless repaired. It was hard to find any detail about the shop beyond this. I imagined the shop would be in Sneinton, given how locally Frank had lived up to that point. From the newspaper reports alone, it'd be easy to paint Frank as a bad egg, often involved in some criminal activity. If the sum total of someone's bad deeds, though, was to steal potatoes and radio valves and then buy some stolen coal, I can't be too critical. In my mind, receiving stolen coal in the 40s is the equivalent of having a chipped skybox in the current era. We know it shouldn't be done, but if someone we know does it, we don't worry too much. I love the fact Frank continued his hobby of wireless making and eventually got a shop of his own. And probably a soft touch, but the fact he had a difficult life and still went on to turn his hobby into a business I think is admirable. It's not easy to start and run a business, and most of us don't try. Frank though did try. He may have succeeded or even excelled. He might not, but at least he did try. We drew a blank on finding the location of Frank's shop. We believe it was in Sneinton somewhere. I like to think that behind one of the modern shop signs, maybe Food Junction, maybe the Dental Centre, maybe Euro Mini Market or Rice Bowl Chinese Takeaway, there might be an old sign for Frank's wireless store, hidden for now, but waiting to be rediscovered someday.